Hello, this lecture covers Chapter 11 in the VanWormer book, Ethnicity, Culture, and the Socioeconomic Determinants of Addiction. So we're primarily looking at different minority groups within this chapter, and there's a lot more that goes into determining whether or not someone's going to have an addiction or predisposed than genetics, and race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status play a big part in that. So first off, we need to look at the socio-political context of being a minority, and this is going to shift and change contextually based off of which minority group we are looking at. We have to look into ethnocultural norms. For each group, they're very, very different. If we look at things like filial piety and traditions of respect and matriarchal versus patriarchal cultures as well, all of that goes into play. The CSWE lists the ability to engage diversity and difference in practice as one of the 10 core competencies, as does NADAC, and it is required in the WACS and RCW that you receive diversity and cultural training every so often, and it is also a requirement of many agencies as well, yearly diversity training. Okay. So in order to enhance treatment, we need to know something about the norms of particular groups and what that looks like. Okay. So social class impacts drug use and recovery in several different ways in terms of what drugs are being used in which areas. And there's also a geographic component to this that we've spoken about before as well. Which drugs are available where. Okay. And the potency of drugs might be different for those in lower class or higher class milieus. Okay. Drug use is absolutely affected by unemployment and low income status. And drug recovery is affected by that too. Largely, does somebody have the means to seek treatment? Are the resources there? Are there alternatives there? Does a person have access to training? So on page 434, conditions of marginalized people that make engagement in treatment more difficult would be lack of money, skills, and language to negotiate the treatment system, high tolerance for pain and suffering, illegal status, negative experiences in other service systems, courts, child welfare, schools, cultural or religious beliefs that conflict with mainstream treatment centers, and fear of losing face or bringing shame on the family by disclosing personal problems. Okay. So we're looking both at socioeconomic and cultural differences there as well. So one of the things that we have is a paradigm whereas immigrants to the United States are much less likely to have addictions, whereas their children that are born in the United States have a much higher chance of delinquency and drug use and social problems. So that's what meant as acculturation increases, so does substance misuse and crime. Okay, so looking at Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, they have the low rate of substance use, just over 3%. Japanese Americans drink much more than Chinese Americans, and the alcohol within different Asian cultures might be a little bit different. Okay. The success is often related to education, home, and urbanization. And we see that by far and large, Asian Americans have the highest levels of education and wealth. Okay. Right. We need to look at the specific Asian countries in order to look at historical trauma. For example, Cambodia and Vietnam have really high rates of trauma. Okay. We have a tradition of filial piety with Asian traditions, and in that, matters are generally solved at home without help from outsiders, which is another barrier to accessing treatment. Okay. With a lot of shame and emotional sharing may lead to loss of faith. So there are gender differences there as well. So it's important to look at how can we structure treatment and services to respect culture to help people more that might be needing help. Okay. All right. We're looking at gender differences. Again, in Native Hawaiians, female elders provide culturally based treatment. And we cannot ignore the spiritual aspect there as well. And we're seeing an increase of yoga and meditation within treatment, and not just drug and alcohol treatment, but mental health, and even cancer treatment, PTSD, and other things. Because it does many things, but it's incredibly self-soothing, and it allows a person to self-soothe from the inside out rather than taking outside stimuli like sex, drugs, shopping, gambling, to manage stress and other things. We see from yoga research that yoga helps to increase cognitive functioning, which helps to decrease impulsivity, violence, and anger. We need to look at historical trauma, which is passed down from generation to generation. And we also see this with epigenetics. Racism and children were once sent to boarding schools to destroy culture, and this is still relatively fresh. The Indian Child Welfare Act of 1975, with the social workers, made it so that children had to go through tribal services, and we need to, there's a difference between CPS on the reservations and CPS, in the greater community. So we have the Indian Child Welfare Act and ICWF specific social workers, so that we're trying to place Native children in Native homes. NPR did an expose on this a couple years ago. I believe it was South Dakota and some of the Plain states, where Native children are still being taken at a really high rate and basically sold and adopted out to white families and not staying on the reservations. Okay. Right. Native Americans are less than 0.9% of the U.S. population. Almost half report that they are of mixed rate. And we see high rates of substance abuse or dependence, 15.5% illicit drug use, 18.3% binge drinking, 22% cigarette use, 41.8%, and a high fatal accident rate and fetal alcohol syndrome. However, the text notes that in certain areas of Alaska, we are seeing decreased rates in fetal alcohol syndrome and fetal alcohol effect. Now, what we're often seeing, especially in areas like ours in Washington State, where we have a large Native population, we're seeing blended treatment approaches that take into consideration Native practices and spirituality. And one of those is the use of the medicine wheel, sweat lodges at treatment centers, as well as the Red Road to Sobriety, sometimes called Wellbriety, White Buffalo organization. It's a fantastic website. They have a book and a workbook and a daily inspirational quote that you can get by email, but it's a practice that incorporates 12-step and principles of sobriety into Native American tradition using balance and the medicine wheel, and it has very good effect. All right. When we're looking at Hispanics, we're looking at ethnicity rather than race, because we can have a lot of different races within the ethnicity, and within the Hispanic ethnicity, we see a lot of multiculturalism. Okay, so the book notes that race and ethnicity are rather fluid concepts, and that's what makes it very challenging to gather demographics and to have hard numbers, because these are largely social concepts and can change. And also, somebody might learn more about their family or choose to check different boxes on demographic forums depending where they are in their life. Right? If someone's having a particularly difficult time accepting the Black side of their family, they might say that they're Latina instead of Black, or instead of checking off of the multicultural box. So we just need to have that in mind when we're looking at demographics. Now, in the United States, 58% of Hispanics in the U.S. are Mexicans. Right? And what's interesting here when we're looking at race and ethnicity, different substances are higher for different genders within the ethnicities. Okay, right. So we have higher rates of methamphetamine and alcoholism, okay, in Hispanics, and that varies a little bit with gender. Okay, and it also varies among countries and territories. So, for example, Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans. Right. Right. Gambling is an increasing issue with the Hispanic community, as well as HIV and AIDS. Okay. One of the issues with accessing treatment is the lack of health insurance, and certainly at this point in our country's history, we are in a very inflammatory period of history in regards to people of Hispanic ethnicity and immigrants in our countries, particularly from South America and Mexico and Central America. Right. Okay. So when looking at treatment for Hispanics, we need to look at the male and female role differentiation in terms of child care, respect, age. So you as the person of the counselor, you're going to be perceived differently depending on who your client is. So an older male Hispanic might treat a younger white female differently rather than a female Hispanic. Okay. And that's going to change depending on your age and who you're working with. Right. For Native Americans, and especially Hispanics, it's very important to incorporate the family aspect whenever possible, doing family counseling and bringing other people into the discussion to support the loved one with the addiction, looking at family strengths. Okay, and household makeups might look a lot different than they do for Caucasian Americans. We might see more multi-generational homes, okay, as well. One of the things that's been very successful is having bilingual counselors and having translators available and making sure that all documents are in multiple languages, especially English and Spanish. And again, we're looking at that immigrant paradox where second generation family members have more addiction problems and more acculturation problems, or acclimation problems rather, due to acculturation than their parents or maybe grandparents that immigrated. Okay. And part of that is due to being caught in between two different cultures and where do loyalties lie. And technology, I think, plays a role into that as well. Okay. So when we're looking at treatment, we need to look at the 6 dimensions of ASAM, but all the dimensions that affect a person's life and their needs. And some of the most effective treatment doesn't even mention drugs, but it looks at the different areas of one's life. And that's particularly true for Hispanics and African Americans. So in the United States, currently African Americans are just about 12% of the population, but we know that they are arrested for drugs at a higher rate and incarcerated for many things at a higher rate than their white counterparts. The rate of addiction is about 8.8%, and 24% report binge drinking. And binge drinking is definitely a concern, maybe more so than in other groups. And drug use is lower at 9.6%. So across the board, especially in the United States and worldwide, alcohol is about 80% of the problem, 80 to 90%. And then we have drugs being the other 10 to 20%. Okay. All right. Now, I think that this might be underreported as well. 44% of inmates are sentenced for illicit drug involvement. Remember that people are not always caught for what they're doing. So I would say that drug use is probably a lot higher than that. whereas what they're arrested for might be under a different class, like property crimes. Okay, right. So it would make sense that of the people that gamble, there is a higher addiction rate. Now, African Americans do not have, and we discuss this in chapter 5, don't have a particularly high gambling rate, about 5% or so, but of those who gamble, the addiction rate is high. So we need to be careful and really look at how we're interpreting statistics. And we still have a very high rate of HIV, new HIV cases in those that are African American. So looking at these statistics and these characteristics, we need to look at how can we best serve this population in treatment. Okay. Now, higher social class, church attendance, and marriage are protective factors. Okay. And not only looking at race and ethnicity, but looking at gender and age, because we're going to see differences there as well. Okay. Right. The poverty rate for African Americans is still twice as high as that for whites. Okay. And we need to look at advertising and how marketing affects African Americans and potentially fuels poverty. Now, for this particular population, recovery relates to spirituality and family support, maybe more so than other populations. And again, looking at not just talking about drugs and drug education, but why are people using drugs? Why are the drug rates the way that they are? And what do they need? So when we're looking at addiction and suicide, which are factors that influence one another, we need to look at what are protective factors and what are risk factors, and how can we increase the protective factors like education, strong family, spirituality, and decrease risk factors. Right. Okay. Now, some of the barriers for this population include Medicaid paperwork, waiting in lines, bureaucracy, shame and guilt, wanting to hide problems, fear of the government, fear of CPS involvement, fear of incarceration, and nowadays, definitely fear of law enforcement. Okay. So this chapter looks a lot at historical trauma, and the first chapter of your book really covers this as well, and looking at trauma. And again, remember that different generations are going to react differently depending on immigration status. Okay. Especially when we're out here in Washington, when we have such diversity, one of the best things that agencies can do is hire people from diverse cultures, especially those that are fluent in languages. So you might pass job postings that are asking for people that speak Cantonese, Cambodian, Vietnamese, and Slavic languages. Okay. I hope you enjoyed this chapter. It's a rather long chapter with a lot of statistics, and the main takeaways are that we have to look at cultural, socioeconomic status, gender, and age, and that intersectionality of a person in order to find the best practices.